Okay, I'll take over from Amanda. Thank you, Amanda. We have a special guest with us today. Last night we had the exhibition reception for our International Paperworks 2025, which was juried by Michael Reedy. Michael Reedy's solo exhibition in the INT'L Gallery is also on display, Extraordinarily Ordinary. And Mr. Reedy is joining us today from Michigan. He is a professor at Eastern Michigan University School of Art and Design. He currently lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and he makes amazing work. So without any more notes from us, I'll turn it over to Michael. We could all give him a warm Minot welcome. All good.
It's my understanding that the end there will be some time for questions if you have any. Just to give you a little bit of insight into how I tried to put this together, trying to give you a sense of how my work sort of developed over an extended period of time, just by little snapshots of how sort of the ideas became maybe a little richer, a little more personal over time. And then talk about sort of my practice, kind of what I look at, what inspires me, how I kind of work through sketches to some degree. And I'll talk a little bit about my process as well, because a lot of times when I give talks, or even with my own students here at Eastern, when I bring in work and share it with them, they're always interested in me bringing in things as I'm making it, because they like to understand the different steps or processes I use to create effects in my work. So I'll try to address that to some degree as well. So I think I just moved into this. So first of all, whenever I give talks, this is how I feel inside. So every one of my paintings and drawings is this behind it all. And these are my parents, neither of which are artistic. They don't have, nobody in my family has a background in visual arts, so they always sort of wonder where I came from. But I sort of attribute it to my parents surrounding me by so many wonderful patterns and colors in their attire. I've been drawing since a very early age. This is my explanation of where poo goes. And not to forgo my time in 3D works, but I'm exclusively a drawer. And this type of work that you're seeing here is probably dominated the way I made drawings for almost a decade. A piece early on in this series actually was included in a paperworks exhibition at Minot quite a long time ago and was purchased into their collection there. At this time I was dealing with sort of psychological portraiture, started playing with how I was treating the ground plane or space around the figure to try to activate it to do something more than just serve as a generic context or background for the figure. But it was around this time that my brother, this is a drawing I made of him at the time, became extremely ill. I do want to say up front, because when I don't say this early enough, some people get concerned. He is perfectly okay. It worked out. But at the time, it was pretty dire, pretty scary what he was going through. And my brother is one of these reclusive people who doesn't like to be photographed. There aren't many pictures of him. And I was spending a lot of time with him, and he was passing out a lot from his medications and everything he was going through. And I just started drawing while he slept as a way to sort of cope with everything. And it was around that time that I was seeing all of this medical stuff and reading sort of about his conditions. And I became really interested in sort of the didactic imagery, this informational imagery that is in these sort of medical texts explaining processes, things that are happening inside our bodies. And I got motivated to make this piece in response to everything I was thinking and feeling at that time. And I used the sort of didactic imagery almost to inflict pain, for lack of a better word, on the figure. It wound up being a lot more dark than my future work would be. I think at this time it was so sort of driven by a pretty raw emotion and feeling at that time that was pretty grim, maybe, in a lot of its perspective on these things. But it was kind of a big turning point. I didn't really deal with medical imagery or anatomy for quite a while after that. And it was maybe 3 or 4 years later, I started making these paintings. And I became interested in anatomical illustration and kind of how these images of the open body and their history, to teaching moral lessons and kind of creating a clinical distance for doctors and practitioners, to deal with surgeries and things like that. I wanted to humanize these images, and I also wanted to note them as sort of having a placeholder in our sensibilities as people. So I asked all the models who posed for this series 5 questions, and it was, what's your favorite color, which you can see influenced the background. What was your favorite childhood cartoon? What was your favorite childhood picture book? How old do you think you'll be when you'll die? And what do you think you'll die of? And Jessica on the left gave the answer red, Animaniacs. I forget her picture book now. She said 69, possibly 80 was when she thought she would pass away, and she thought she'd die of ovarian cancer. So I sort of opened up her body and inflicted that organ. So I did a number of these paintings, and I was really kind of excited, interested in making them. But they became really formulaic after a short while, and I sort of moved on. And I started making more these types of drawings where I was talking more universally about man and woman and just being a person and alive. And I was kind of interested in this idea of expulsion and becoming aware of our physical limits, right? The fact that we'll die, the fact that we are shameful, that we're, basically in a state of needing to reproduce, right? And so we're in this weird state of living death, I guess you could say. And I remember hanging these at a show here at Eastern, and one of the reporters for the paper and photographer came up and said, "Hey, can I ask you a couple things about your work? Can you summarize in a few sentences?" And I said, "Oh, I can do better. I'll do 2 terms." And I said, "Pain and genitals." Needless to say, I didn't make the paper with that response. But it was sort of this gross reduction of personhood into this idea that we're here to reproduce, that we're physical, that we suffer, we're full of pain, and ultimately we die. So this idea of procreation and death started to really shape a lot of pieces that I made around this time. All of them are similar to the size of works that you're seeing there in the show, in case you're wanting some context for how big these things are. A lot of this is just charcoal work, black colored pencil, maybe watercolor, ballpoint pen, things like that. So I made a whole bunch of these where I was just playing with anatomy in different ways, just to create sort of effects and to create sort of dramatic images. Eventually, around this time, I really got engaged with this idea of the theatrical excess that I was sort of leaning into on the pieces. And I made this piece, and the counterpart on the right is a 3D anaglyphic version of it. And that means a red-blue channel, old school 3D type image. It took a lot of work, but I thought, well, how can I make this even more absurd? How can I embrace the spectacle concept even harder? And I thought, at this time, 3D movies were very popular. This was post-Avatar. Every movie coming out seemed to have a 3D variant. So I thought, well, I'm going to make 3D variants of my pieces, and I'll astound the audience. They'll just be amazed in the spectacle that is my work. And to give you a sense of what the 3D sort of dimension looks like, that kind of shows you the range of depth I got out of creating the anaglyph. Sometimes people wonder how I did it. I went in and actually manually, in a digital environment, I took a 9-quadrant photograph of the original painting. I stitched it together. I cut every element you see onto its own layer in Photoshop. And then I organized them by space, and then each of those elements got cut into additional pieces. From her elbow to her back elbow, I think was 9 spatial steps. In the end, I think I had 120 unique steps into depth into the piece. And when you make an anaglyph, you'll notice in the rotation that things sort of like tuck out from behind the figure and, reemerge from other elements. None of that existed in the original drawing, obviously, because it's just a flat 2D drawing. So I had to digitally backdraw all of the pieces that were being revealed when you sort of shifted from a right to a left eye perspective in the work. So needless to say, I did not make as many of these as possible as I wanted to. Originally, I was working with a gallery, and I thought it would be a real funny gag to have my show at the front of the gallery, and in the back have a 3D variant and charge people $1 extra to see it. Because I thought, well, you can get the boring normal version up front, but if you want the really good 3D version, it comes with a premium. So I was making, eventually I made this piece, which is probably one of my most misunderstood drawings. It kind of goes back to that initial piece that I showed you where I was playing with psychological narratives. These were based on true case studies, actually, of mental disorders. And this was one that was inspired by a narrative where the male figure was actually trying to save his partner and ultimately, though, hurt her. But I had this hanging in a show at the Scarab Club in Detroit, and they didn't know me, so I'm just listening to people talk about my work, and I heard some people really going at it about this piece and declaring that I was misogynistic and must hate women and all of these sorts of things. So I sort of shuttered this piece away, and it really made me step back and think, why am I making this work? Like, what are the figures doing anymore? Is the skeleton now just nothing but death in terms of its symbol use in my work? So I went back to that original piece and I made and reinvented it during the time when my brother was ill, and tried to reconnect with what it was that really attracted me to anatomy in the first place. That original work was also made with a female model, even though I wanted it to be a male because it was about my brother. But it was the summertime, and I couldn't get a hold of male models. I worked a lot with models that at that time that worked at the university, so it was just harder to get a hold of people. And so anyway, it was like, okay, I'm going to go back and I'm going to take this piece, and this time I'll do it as a male, and I'll actually play more with this sort of neutral language of anatomical illustration. And I have the skeleton that's impacted with organs, and they're all color-coded like this. And I wanted them to be really playful and look fake. I didn't want the organs to be gruesome and real. I wanted to sort of play with the fact that this was artificial. And I started coating things. This was the first piece I made where I started coating all of the organs with glitter and making everything really sparkly to kind of suggest a wetness, but also a candy-like quality. I liked the fact that there was something brittle about it. When it was on the bones, there was something candy-like about it when it was on the organs. And I just became really enamored with the effects I was getting out of that. So when I hang them together, I really mimicked my old techniques with the idea that I could make them almost hang like a diptych. Around or shortly thereafter, I also started getting a skin condition where I had these rashes and stuff on my face. It turned out to be nothing more than what they call basically face dandruff. It's the same thing that gives people dandruff on their scalp. It can sometimes migrate to your face. It's fairly common, especially in males as they get older. But at that time, I didn't know that, and I was sort of dealing with the fact that I had all of this stuff on my face. I didn't know why. And I was pretty self-conscious about it for the first time. I existed in my own head, and I looked out into the world, and I really didn't have a face that I was conscious of. I just sort of talked to people, and who I was the thinking inside my mind, in my head. So all of a sudden, though, I noticed when I was talking to students and other people that I was actually really acutely aware of where they were looking and how my face felt. So I kind of made this self-portrait almost as a cathartic thing to sort of just work through it. And up in the upper right is sort of this washing hand gesture, like I'm unclean or something. And I really wanted to be masculine about it. So this is a really dated reference, but Steve McQueen from Bullet, he sort of is the symbol of masculinity and rawness of the 70s, and he had a turtleneck. So I was like, I'm going to make a self-portrait, and I'm going to go get a turtleneck. But I'll tell you right now, if you're wanting to look rugged and handsome and cool in a turtleneck, don't get it from Kohl's. I got this turtleneck from Kohl's. I tried it on in the dressing room, and I just started laughing. I was like, okay, I look so absurd. This is absolutely perfect. This was before I think I was aware of how much people connected turtlenecks to Steve Jobs, I guess. But anyway, so I made this portrait, and at the same time, I was also suffering from a lot of weird bone pain and other things. Like, I just didn't physically feel well. Turned out that I just had really severe vitamin D deficiency from living in Michigan, which you might have there in North Dakota. But I started really developing all of these skin techniques and became a lot more obsessive on the surface. I started also playing more with these environments and sort of what I call booger monsters. I'm not very sophisticated. But the one up here on the left, I showed this to my office mate, and I was like, yeah, what do you think of this? And he's like, oh, I love them. I really love this one up here. And I was like, that one up there next to my head? And he said, yeah. And I was like, yeah, that's the one my wife drew. Like, every other one was mine. And I was like, I'm running out of ideas. And I said, can you draw me one? And she drew that on my drawing, and then it turns out to be everyone's favorite monster. But anyway, from all of that, I sort of went into this other stage. I entered this point in my life where me and my wife were talking about starting a family and having children, and sort of this idea of immortality and how you live on, by passing on your genes to your children and things like that. And when I grew up, I got sort of teased a lot for my eyes. It's called bug eyes, things like that. And I had a very limited perspective on what it meant to try to have a child. And I was actually obsessive on, well, I hope they don't inherit my eyes. It became like a weird preoccupation of mine. And the little children that I'm holding in this portrait, actually, their heads are nothing but googly eyes. They rattle, they make noise, everything. So I made this set, the fall man, the fall woman, and ultimately the fall child, which is on view there. These other two pieces I don't have anymore. So, but I still have this guy, and he's still holding that little sphere of eyes. And then I also have my little conflicted symbol down there with my anatomical rabbit, so that he's sort of a death symbol as much as a procreation symbol. I like playing around with my images, when I'm working on them. I like having my own inside jokes that sort of I like to play with. So the ring, of course, of skulls around his head are anamorphic, and it's sort of a riff off of Holbein's Ambassadors, where, if you get in the right position and you look at the painting, then the skull will coalesce into a normal one. So I like that idea of sort of putting the viewer up against the child and manipulating their position relative to the drawing. So I just really started liking the treatment and the way that I was building things. I started developing these more complex spaces that these little characters lived in. And I started playing with this red-blue thing. A lot of people kind of, I think, pulled it like I was referencing Arties and Baines, which in a way I am, like oxygen-rich and oxygen-depleted, like living, dying sort of concepts once again in that relationship to me. But it was really just my love of this painting that I liked since I was probably a teenager. And I just really love this high key saturation red-blue, and it really starts to pop in how I do some things as the work progresses. But these pieces are kind of all exploring this idea of trying to have a child and what it would mean to become a parent, and the fact that you're giving a child its life, but you're also sort of sealing its fate in the inevitable death that we all sort of face. So it's this beautiful sort of conflicted romantic image in a lot of ways. And I should note that the treatment of how I make my work, I always try to make the figures pretty grounded. You know, they're drawn pretty representationally. Um, but then once I move outside of that into these planes that they exist in, I'm trying to create tension by making them jagged and kind of unstable or threatening in a way. The pyramidal forms were really interesting. Everything was sort of constructed out of these pyramid ideas, just because they start with infinite possibilities and of course they end on just one conclusion. But it was more too that it had all this nice form language in how those sort of worked. So I started playing more with constructing these environments so that my figures existed in this tangible space. But then the environment they were in were more fantastic, almost representations of uh, their 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 psychology, their desires, their mindset. Um, so this piece, you know, is one of probably my favorite from the whole series. It's one of them that out of all, I normally don't get sad when I sell work. I'm normally pretty happy to just see it go. This is one of the few pieces that I made that was highly personal, and I really wish I still had. Um, it was around this time that, as I said, we were trying to have a child, and it just wasn't successful for us. We just didn't seem to be able to maintain a pregnancy, and we just were suffering loss constantly through it, and it was a really traumatizing sort of stage, I guess, in our lives together. And this piece was, of course, sort of exploring all of those complex feelings and relationships. Um, so all of the work now kind of, you know, in this little window revolves around all of this sense of loss and isolation, um, along with this. And now you can really see that influence of the Maison Diptych by Fouquet or whatever, with the red and blue sort of angel forms. They became these little skeletal angel angels in my mind that I was putting around these figures to comfort them. Um, this is to give you a sense of the size of the piece, the scale of them. As I said, almost everything I kind of have my figures typically in about a 3/4, you know, 2/3 sort of scale. Um, it's what I prefer. So Dust and Moonshine are both in the piece. At this point, I was getting really kind of worn out by all of the stuff going on, so I just went back to this idea of our physical self and our soul or our spirit and things like that. And there's these sort of guttural releases from these figures, and they kind of work obviously as a diptych. They've been arranged in any number of ways in different shows. I don't know which arrangement I necessarily like the best. Um, but they are actually supposed to be really dual opposites. And once again, the skeleton, I'm not trying to hide the fact that this isn't, you know, about, like, there's a sense of artificiality to everything that's happening in the scene, in the sense that I'm referencing, like, didactic skulls and things like that, which are obviously used in medicine. But alongside all of these bigger pieces, I always make a lot of little pieces, just because galleries like them, they can sell them real easy. So I'm constantly playing with things that happen in these spaces, including making little 3D prints of them. Same sort of thing where you can kind of see the depth rotation I can get out of it by taking an old drawing and digitizing it and slicing it up. Nowadays, there might even be AI that can just do it all for me and save me a lot of work. So I'd make little pieces like this, and sometimes these little drawings become places where I play with ideas and try to rethink what I want to make next. So I got really interested in these little ghost characters, these little sad ghosts that were sort of existing. And I really got fascinated too by the little clip art, cupids and things like that, cherubs that I was looking at the time. So I kind of played around with developing these little character forms for quite a while, giving them a whole bunch of different treatments and just making them like as weird as I possibly could, as playful as I possibly could. And ultimately, I took it into the Death of the Maiden as just like this weird end note to what is otherwise a very sort of somber, serious image on a lot of ways, on a lot of levels. But in the background, above the ring, you'll notice all of these little cherubs, cupids, almost all of them are ascending the figure up to heaven and things like that. But they're clip art, so it's sort of like this tongue-in-cheek sort of reference to the idea that we're sort of being carried to our afterlife on clip art. So to me, and I kind of referenced this at the very end of the lecture, that there's this movie called City Lights by Charlie Chaplin, and it's one of these weird movies that I really, really love. It had an unexpected effect on me when I watched it. The main character that Charlie Chaplin is, the tramp, he goes through so many different transitions in that film where at one moment he is mocked and ridiculed, he is celebrated and sort of loved, he's laughed at, um, he's abandoned. Like, he just goes through all of these arcs where he's really abused in many ways, even though his nature is very giving. And he assists, he helps these people through this process in the film. And at the end, he's finally recognized for who he really is. And that's how the movie ends. And when this moment of recognition occurred in the movie, the first time I saw it, I just started busting out crying. Like, I couldn't even help it. And it's not many movies that do that to me. And I think that a range of emotional complexity of being beautiful, of being really heart-wrenchingly sad, of being cruel, like that range of emotional context is sort of what I hope to put into my work. I want the figures to feel beautiful and loved, but I also want them to feel mocked and isolated, and I want humor in there, and I want bleakness in there. So to me, it's playing with all of these different flavor notes that make developing the drawings a lot of fun for me. So I just kind of kept building along this more theatrical. I'm going back to that 3D work where I was playing with spectacle and this sort of almost like excess, and developing all of these sort of now frameworks where I was creating this whole nother layer of narrative storytelling. And I will say that I'm hidden in almost all my work. If you look long enough, you'll probably find a portrait of me in it. But this treatment is it's like a liner treatment. So there's like 3-layered gray liner work, and then it's coated in glitter. And it was supposed to be really lush and icing-like in my mind when I was trying to develop that look. So several of these pieces obviously are there at the gallery, so you can see them in person and get a better sense for how I developed them. I will say that these vortexes and all of this, they became sort of portals to the afterlife, and they start to take on a more grand quality as my work advanced. And all of this series was sort of built off of this egg compositional design underneath everything. And I like that, creation quality that the egg symbol has. So eventually, though, I made this piece, and it was also into the same sort of loss in everything that was sort of happening in our lives. And this was sort of like a breaking point sort of work for me. It was, to me, a really fun drawing to make. I started playing with a lot of these other sort of symbols and almost like scrolls and decorative motifs along with this sort of grim illustration. And a lot of my work is, which I should have maybe mentioned earlier, a lot of it glows in the dark, which is where I have once again, I just like knowing it does, even though most people don't realize it does. I had a show at 111 Minna Gallery in San Francisco, and they're sort of like a club. They're very posh. They're like a music, bar, club, gallery, all in one. They do a lot of launch parties for Juxtapoze magazine there, and so it's a very, very hip place. And I had a 2-person show there, and I had, I think, maybe about 10 or 12 pieces there. And at the end of the one opening night, he was closing down at like 2 o'clock, and I got this email from him at like 2:30 in the morning that said, "I just locked up, and as I turned off the lights and looked back to key the door, I saw your work glowing in the gallery." It's like, yay! But anyway, all of these things are just kind of more elaborate ways of kind of exploring the same sort of ideas um, of death and sort of mocking my own sort of preoccupation with my mortality. Um, this piece is referencing back to Hodler's Night. I don't know if you know the painting, but it's sort of like the night terrors and sort of being taken away in our sleep and things like that. Is the main thing that drove this piece, for instance. I feel like I want to just zip along and just get to a couple really quick things just so I can wrap it up. And then this piece, of course, that's in the gallery, it also, that whole organ ghost that streams through the center, of course, glows in the dark as well. This piece was sort of the same thing where, it's this fantastic nightmare of death and sort of our spirit being sucked up into this portal and basically shot through a grinder as we enter the afterlife or the unknown of the afterlife. So anyway, alongside those, a lot of these motifs pop up in all this little work that I just sort of make on the side, just because, as I said, they're easy to make. I can work through techniques or think through ideas and color combination to see what I want to open up next. But all of my work just starts in this very simple way with these little sketchbooks. This is when I first started making my little ghost guys and thinking about them. And obviously that sketch became the drawing you're seeing there. And even when I'm coming up with bigger pieces, they're normally really chicken scratch, and then I start making a more clean mock-up that I'll show my models when I hire them, so that when they come in, I can say, yeah, I was thinking of something like this, can you sit like this, and trying to eventually work out what I want the final piece look like. When it comes to my ideas, obviously I have a lot of just contemporary books on art, but a lot of my things I look at a lot when I want visual inspiration are like these old myth and magic books. They're really cool and just these old illustrations. I always find looking at things whenever I don't know what to do, I just want to look at things. It's the easiest way to start opening up and kind of stealing compositional ideas even. So like this Map of the Heavens book that I got for the library card, it was like a free giveaway book. And I saw these little orbital things, and I was always making these halos, and I decided to kind of steal them into this painting where there's like these little planets sort of orbiting within the halo of the character. And this sort of organizational system of orbits that actually became the structure for all of these sort of glowing, all these translucent rings that organize in space above the figure. I also like dermatology a lot. The skin is really important as a symbol in my work, just because it shows like perseverance. It shows like the sense that we're physical, that it shows our resistance to the world around us. It marks our history. So even in this, where there's a lot of things that are maybe edging on gruesome in terms of how the skin is treated, I actually consider that to be beautiful and to actually make the figure more tangible and accessible instead of being something to be shamed by or something. So I really started looking at these blemishes and translucencies and veins as sort of marks of humanity, of just being alive and being physical and being beautiful. Those background elements are always motivated by this old pulpy sort of horror poster art. I love looking at things like that. I also really love old 3D comic books. I buy as many of them as I can. And I really like, believe it or not, like I love the cover album art of death metal tremendously. It influences a lot of my thinking these days. They kind of exist in the same world as like, fake wrestling. So anyway, right now, spectacle, these genres of excess, which is like melodrama, body horror, pornography, things like that, are sort of things I think about. Mainly the first two. I like this idea of like a really overly dramatic sort of scene. I also like this idea of tension and body horror and things like that. Just because it kind of denies that proper bridge, right, where we create distance and it engages us in this really over-the-top mannerism where we start to feel sort of manipulated, almost like how I felt sort of watching the City Lights film. And this whole